Est-ce que vos films sont bien compris en Europe?
Non, mais mettons-nous bien ça dans la tête. Moi, l'Europe n'est pas mon centre. L'Europe est une périphérie de l'Afrique. Vous voyez, ils sont restés plus de 100 ans chez moi, ils n'ont pas parlé ma langue, je parle leur langue. L'avenir, pour moi, l'avenir ne dépend pas d'être compris par l'Europe. Je souhaiterais qu'ils me comprennent, mais ça ne me fait absolument rien. Si vous prenez la carte de l'Afrique, géographiquement, vous pouvez mettre l'Europe et l'Amérique, il nous resterait encore de la place. Pourquoi voulez-vous que ce tropisme, vous savez le tropisme, pourquoi voulez-vous que je sois comme le tournesol qui tourne autour du soleil? Je suis moi-même le soleil.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. To begin with, I'd like to introduce our lovely artists who are here with us today. To begin with, beside me, we have Jessica Karuhanga, who is a first-generation Canadian artist of the British-Ugandan heritage who addresses the politics of identity and Black diasporic concerns through lens-based technologies, sculpture, writing, drawing, and performance. Karuhanga's work has been presented at venues including Warehouse 9 in Copenhagen, Sarjevsky Otenbury Center, Sarajevo, Mitchell Art Gallery in Edmonton, Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa, Nuit Blanche in Toronto, Onsite Gallery in Toronto, Ramai Modern in Saskatoon, Palace Art Projects in Dublin, WNDX Festival in Winnipeg, The Wrong in Toronto, and Goldsmiths University in London, UK. Her work is also in public collections at Museum London and the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. She holds a BFA from Western University and an MFA from the University of Victoria, and is an assistant professor at Western University. Up next, we have the lovely Racquel Rowe, who is an interdisciplinary artist from the island of Barbados, currently residing in Canada. She's exhibited across Canada and holds an MFA from the University of Waterloo and a Bachelor of the Arts and Honors in History and Studio Art from the University of Guelph. She is also currently in the Visual Arts PhD program here at Western. Her practice is continuously influenced by many aspects of history, matrilineal structures, diasporic communities, and her upbringing in Barbados. Her works take the form of performance, video, site-specific work, and installation. So, the center of the world was beach. Drawing inspiration from Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, The Center of the World Was Beach is a meditation on migration, memory, and identity. Anchored by themes of diasporic connection, domestic spaces, and cultural rituals, the exhibition explores how landscapes, both physical and interior, become sites of cultural community and transformation. Through a series of video works, photographs, and intimate installations, the exhibition transforms the gallery into a living room, evoking the warmth and familiarity of shared histories. Each monitor plays a story, weaving together personal and collective narratives of the Caribbean diaspora, where migration reshapes domestic life, rituals, anchor identity, and the beach becomes a symbolic threshold of loss and becoming. The body of work reflects on the everyday as extraordinary, where food, family, objects, and memory hold space of belonging, resistance, and renewal across generations. Okay, so to begin with, before we run into the questions, can I ask how you guys came to be here today?
I can go first. I arrived here today a long, long time ago. I arrived via boat across a long journey on the sea. I arrived via plane and tumultuous turbulence. I arrived from the western coast of Africa. I arrived via ship from Ireland, and I come here today with lots of longing, desire, and angst, but also optimism.
For me, I arrived here today from the seaside in England and also East Africa, along the Great Lakes of Africa. I came here via my mother, who came here as an immigrant, came to Canada as an immigrant as a 4-year-old in the 60s, and my father, who came here as a refugee during the Idi Amin years in Uganda. I arrive here reflecting on growing up in southwestern Ontario, in proximity to this site that we're here today. Thrilled to be supporting a colleague, friend, mentee, and share our work and ideas with you today.
I personally came to be here today. I think I sound like I'm repeating, but basically through the sea, through the ocean. I feel like my entire identity and my life has been very closely linked to the sea. And I come to be here again through my mother, who encouraged me to leave my home country to explore the arts and explore what can be offered maybe outside of home. So, yeah.
Should I provide some context for that? Okay, so the prompt that Kira gave us is actually from a masterclass that I attended at University of Toronto in 2017, led by the scholar, poet, philosopher Fred Moten. And I think there was maybe 10 or 15 of us there, but he began that session by asking how we arrived here. And it was interesting as we moved around the table in this kind of very archetypal institutional space or boardroom, all the kind of intimate ways people shared. Some people, it was about the minutia of their day, walking through the rain and the sounds of the rain. It was a very beautiful April day. Some of them talked about their family history, all sorts of different approaches. And it's been something that I've brought into some of my classes. I'm doing it in the grad seminar I'm teaching right now, where every week we start class asking how we arrived here, because I think, you know, experience is temporal, and what might be in the foreground of our mind and experience can shift at any given time. We have ups and downs. And so it's absolutely, if I have to give a citation, this is not my invention. The credit goes to Fred Moten. And yeah, I encourage you to think about that as you arrive to any forms of collectivity or gatherings.
I will also, thank you, Jessica. I will also mention the video played at the start is a video Jessica offered me for my citation after a spiral about presenting and making this work that's very much about and situated within the Caribbean in a Canadian context. And we had a long discussion about decentering Euro-American views of life and art and everything else, which I think we'll probably get into in this discussion.
Definitely the moment that I saw your show and experienced the installation, all the landscapes and water, and the title of your show specifically, I immediately thought of Sambian's filmmaking and thinking of the rich history of Senegalese, Cameroonian, Nigerian filmmakers, West African filmmakers, especially how you articulate diaspora. I thought it was like a happy and meaningful coincidence. So that's why we shared and began with that video today.
Would anyone in the audience like to volunteer an answer? Yes, no, maybe? Okay.
That's fine.
To continue, we actually have a fun activity for you guys before we start the discussion. As you can see, we have a wall of paper on each side of the room. If you'd like, you can draw entirely from memory the place that you're from. We have markers and other art supplies up at the front, so feel free to.
You can pass out the markers. I'm going to roll this out here.
So if you didn't hear, we're going to spend 5 to 10 minutes recreating images of homes. Let's start.
Ooh, what happened with this? You can stretch it there. So you can draw on the walls, or if you want to get low to the ground, you can draw on this as well. And this exercise is just supposed to be intuitive. For those of you on Zoom, you would have been shared a link to, I forget what it's called, a scallop draw, and you can digitally participate in the activity.
I'm like in the corner.
Sorry, do you want me to move? You are the star of the show.
Oh, no.
Thank you.
Mine's gonna be abstract. I like
Here.
How long did you go for?
Just a week. So this mostly around 5 hours more than that.
Mine is also moving in fast, like space and computer.
Draw. Draw again. Fine.
I took this really abstractly.
Prime works in here. I did love her response. It was awesome. It's so poetic.
What color?
This is great. Green and red.
Red. Blue. Red. I don't know.
Everyone's sandwich would be like yeah, well, I'm just gonna flip time.
I don't know. Mine is literally abstract work. Oh, bro.
I want more of you, remember? In a really platonic way. Just I should make that clear. That was just I have no idea what it is.
I think that you are
Some of them. Do we get to talk about our work?
Great. Don't have it in. Enjoy it. I think we're just like that until
Yeah.
if there's time in the question and answer, I think I'll bring it up. I want abstract.
I love that.
I don't want to see what other people.
I know. It looks like people are starting to sit down. Thank you.
That's a playground. And then across from elementary school.
It's so
And I could spot yours from a mile away.
with a puppy.
And the puppy. And
Thank you for helping. I like your drawing.
oh, yes, I know.
Yeah.
Oh, red.
Yes, okay, your drawing. Thank you for coming as well.
I just saw your drawing.
Ooh. I was like, ooh. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm out of gas. Wait, I know.
That was great.
They're both jumping when I know I'm right.
I like the mix of like physical places and metaphorical system and time.
It was really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of is like a childhood memory.
Yeah, I like the shoe.
Yeah.
What's happening over there?
I don't know.
The cosmos?
Yeah.
Did you miss me?
Yes.
Hey, do you guys want me to fire through every question, or do you think it will flow from like? Do you want me to like fire through every question, or do you think you'll be able to like flow from one topic to the other?
You can ask us and then we'll both respond and then you can ask us the next one.
Yeah. Thank you for indulging us in this memory exercise. The different interpretations are really lovely.
Yeah, I think it's really nice to see like from physical representations of place to some of us who went more abstract and less linear to the cosmos. And there's like a lot of interesting things happening on the walls and the floor. Thank you guys for participating.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to get into our discussion. I have some questions to grill you guys with, so I'm sorry in advance. To begin with, can I ask what the beach, ocean, sea represents to each of you?
Yeah, I might drabble on, so bear with me. I've been thinking about the sea, the ocean, the beach for a couple of years now. Ever since I did a commission work for Museum London, so I guess some of those origins do originate here in London, Ontario. I made a work called Bodies of Water that kind of like traces different Atlantic histories. It's like filmed in Barbados, but there's also a component of the original work from Museum London that's filmed here in town, like featuring the Thames, and then it also features like Lake Huron and a couple of different locations that were familiar to me. And in this current work and the things I'm thinking about now, I keep coming back to that. This like current interest or fixation with the water is also, like, funnily enough, born in like Newfoundland. Like I went there for the first time in 2022 and I went up to Port Union and was completely like enamored with like the environment and the whole experience of being like that far on part of the Atlantic that I hadn't necessarily been to before, like compared to the Caribbean. I think it's probably like a very obvious answer to think about like growing up on a tropical island and like going to the beach and like these kinds of maybe a more linear narrative, but I think that it's actually a lot of different experiences and things that have also like taken place in my life in Canada that allowed me to like conceptualize the water like beyond my everyday. I want to talk more about the water, but I'll pause for a moment.
Kind of riffing off of you, and your relationship, almost like the way you describe different beaches or shorelines, Raquel, feels very indicative of the embodied experience of diasporic experience. I remember I used to visualize like diasporic, whether it's like being first gen or whether you arrived here through the transatlantic slave trade, and all the different instances is almost like not so much a rootlessness, but almost like the roots or tethers are like the large reed like seaweed roots that I see, where there's like movement that it's like, and I always saw it as being placed in sort of water, or it could be earth, but it's like more like sand where it like moves. I started my year like right in January, like New Year's, which I mean, there's many different New Years for different cultures and communities, but it still feels like a punctuation because of the energy of everyone. In Zanzibar with my sister and father, and being along the Indian Ocean was quite magnificent and moving. It's such a rich history for those of you that don't know, in terms of slave trade, spice trade, all these really interesting forms of commerce and travel, these dhow boats that originate through that passageway or channel. And so we were sitting like eating food by the ocean, and there's all these children, like thousands of children, like swimming in the shores and playing games, and it was a very beautiful thing. And it just reminded me how I always feel most home at the water. It's very calming for me. I grew up where Lake Huron meets Lake St. Clair and goes into, the St. Clair River then goes into Lake St. Clair. It's why Sarnia, where I grew up, is called Sarnhole, as in being the asshole of Ontario, or it's called Chemical Valley. So Lake Huron was a beautiful beach to grow up on, and it wasn't until I went away and, resented my hometown and come and visit that I would see how blue that lake is. And also reflecting on that, it's interesting how my family arrived in that place that in both sides, they come from places near the water. So my mom, on my mom's side, they're from, and also places of industry. So on my mom's side, they're from Essex, like near Southend-on-Sea, and Grays and Purfleet, which is like where there's a massive Procter & Gamble factory. And then on my father's side, you have the Great Lakes. So everyone knows Lake Victoria. It's one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And then there's Lake Edward, Lake Alberta, all very British colonial names. So going there for the first time as a young adult was very powerful. Just eating fish from this place that my family and ancestors are from. So that's my relationship to the sea, to bodies of water, and different shorelines.
Yeah, if I just could continue on moment like briefly about it. I also have a body of work called Saltwater Cures All that deals almost entirely with like conceptions of the water and like mythos around the sea. Like at first we'll trace historical origins of like Black bodies in the Caribbean, like through the transatlantic slave trade, but then also looking at mythos around the sea. So at the time I was like looking at West Africa and like water, spirits, deities, gods, and the kind of like mythos that has emerged like historically to present, both in like some kind of like can't remember the name, like it's a Caribbean children's book, but also looking at like baptism type of rituals that are like centered in like the southern US that I don't see as like often taking place anymore outdoors, and how like those practices have shifted, but they're still very much about like place and like centering yourself. I think I'm also like from my perspective in Barbados very lucky to have grown up in a place where all of the beaches are public and most of them do have a public access point, but like within the research thinking about islands or places where like that access to the water is limited, and then how that can like affect local or indigenous populations. And the first time I kind of like started showing these works about the water, I had a great conversation with someone in Vancouver about like both Black and indigenous practices like with salt water and like the healing properties of the ocean, which was really interesting to think about those parallels as well, which also came up in my visit to Newfoundland. So I think there's just so many kind of like elastic kind of like temporal timelines almost, like they're not like they're flowing and they're parallel and they're all happening at the same time kind of, and that's how I also feel about the ocean.
That is so beautiful. Sorry. But up next, I'd like to ask, both of your work often engages with the body. How do you see that element kind of manifesting or not manifesting in your work?
You want to go first?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I think that most of my work, like if you've seen or haven't seen any of my previous work, most of it, I'm in it, and it does deal heavily with the body. With this show specifically and this work, I've kind of removed some of that aspect, or at least having myself in the work. And I'm really also just interested in returning to this playful experimentation within video itself. I've always told people that I'm a video artist, but who approaches video like a painter. And I feel like that can sound really far-fetched, but if you like can follow my train of thought, I think when you are like in those early art school days and you have a foundation in painting, then when you get to video, I think that the way you think about aesthetics or maybe even narrative, or the way that you construct like an underpainting, I feel like that very much translates to the way I both like shoot, edit, and construct the experience of video. So like right now I'm thinking about this like return to video art in a way that I haven't before. Like I'm looking at different artists, like looking at a lot more Caribbean artists these days, which I also want to talk about, which is influencing how I've seen the work. I just started like this giant lovely thing on like surrealism and Caribbean and African diasporic art, and it gave me like an epiphany of, oh, okay, I am returning to pictorialism. I am turning video back into still image, and I want video to look like painting. And I think I've always wanted video to look like painting, and that is happening more within this work and this show with some other things I've done.
Yeah, I can kind of see that because the way you've installed the work in your show, it's almost like a video collage. It's also a sculpture. And I can see the paintings in that you've disintegrated the images in such a way where it's not just about pixelation, it's also the fragmentation. They're not all decipherable at first. You have to kind of spend time with them. Some of them almost feel like GIFs, and some of them are a little bit glitchy. And I think that really speaks to displacement, loss. It speaks to memory. And I also think, I think sometimes maybe there's a more immediacy to the dimensions of like time and space in terms of lens-based kind of technologies. But I think all art is an experience, and I would rather call people experiencers than viewers. And I would say, paintings can be just as evocative as like a film that has a particular like score that moves in a specific way, or just audio, or I think that's why maybe both of us are kind of like multidisciplinary. It's like whatever the proper channel or conduit that makes sense. In regards to bringing it back to the body, it's deeply personal, but I also think it's a coincidence that a lot of folk who do performance are Black, Indigenous, disabled, insert all the forms of marginality, having those embodiments, and that being a conduit or pathway for expression. For me, I started with my body just because I did want to document other folks, but it felt if I were to be ethical and thoughtful in my approach, I had to start with myself first and work out what the threshold was, what was comfort, what the boundaries were, what like safety kind of looked like, before I felt I could be in a position where I could hold space for other folks. And in terms of embodiment or dealing with the body, it's kind of for me the intersections of Blackness with disability or illness.
I think particularly now, especially with this show as well, I'm thinking about how not the viewer, the experiencer, the participant, how they kind of like, I'm trying to find another word for experience, how they can kind of participate.
Sensors?
Yeah, sensors, how they can participate in the work within their own bodies. Like someone was like, what are you interested in? I'm really interested in that moment where you like sit in the exhibition and you're like sinking into the couch and you might be getting kind of bored and you're trying to pay attention and you're like, what am I looking at? And I really like that moment where you're no longer paying attention perhaps, but everything in the video, it's like shifting around in your subconscious. It's in like the peripheries of your mind, your eyes. You're like still looking, but you're not focused. And I'm like really interested in like what can emerge for people in those moments, like where the work takes you or where it doesn't take you, or how it like pulls and pushes you like out of the gallery.
You're almost describing stuff that's ineffable, because I think there's limitations to language. There's a lot of languages that are lost or dead, which is complicated when we're talking about the histories we're talking about. So I feel like, yeah, there's that part as well. And the powerful part about the ineffable is there's other pathways to encounter or enter the work or let it like wash over you, right? And it's almost like when you're no longer trying to arrive at a destination or define what you're looking at, you're no longer like seeking or looking at art. And I mean that in the institutional kind of way or canonical way, where it's like painting is, these are the terms or definitions or traits of a painting, or this, like these kind of categories or classification systems. When you let all of that go, and so yeah, that brings it back to why I think the experience thing matters. And I think particularly when we're dealing with temporalities, whether you are performing or participating or experiencing, I think the first 5 to 10 minutes, I would say 50 up to 50 minutes, you're very cognizant. It's like in the foreground, you're like, you might be getting bored or like shifty or whatever, but then that part where you kind of zone out or don't really know where the journey is going, the like unknowable is like the powerful part. Yeah.
Okay, Racquel, your exhibition engages with ideas of diaspora, ritual, and water. How does water function as a metaphor or a lived experience in your work?
I think that I feel like I've kind of gotten into this already, but let me go for a different approach. I think that the way I'm hoping to engage with water now, or where I see myself going, is hopefully going to be in like a direct conversation, perhaps, with things that are happening within the Caribbean. I think sometimes I'm like on the cusp or teetering on the line of some of these things. Like for me, I know that there's like in one of the videos, there's like children frolicking on like a parked jet ski in the water, and it pans to like a beach like full of tourists, and in the other video it is like other like tourist people, and they're like enjoying their holiday. So I think for me it's like a shift, or maybe not a shift, but maybe a more direct conversation of the water and like those beach spaces as political. I think a lot, especially in the winter, about like this idea of like going on vacation and this idea of escape.
Snowbirds.
Yeah, this idea of like escape from reality that is present in like Euro North American centric kind of spaces, and what the kind of like other side of that looks like is something like that's like deeply in my subconscious, like those kinds of experiences. And I'm definitely interested in like what kind of commentaries like I can make in the future on tourism and how that relates back to how we interact with the water and the people in those places. And it helps to have like discovered a world of other like Caribbean artists who are like commenting on these things.
A couple things that I'm thinking of. Earlier when I was mentioning the ineffable, I was thinking of something that it's not about refusing translation, but like precedes the translation. It's untranslatable. And I think more and more, I'm not convinced or interested, and I get the sense from you too, in appealing to others or whoever has the kind of status quo about the value of what you're doing. So that's the one thing. And then in terms of economies, economic systems, particularly tourism, definitely if we look at all sorts of these places, particularly in the Caribbean, the cult of tourism, and I want to see more like a kind of reclamation or just a transformation of what that meaning kind of looks like. In terms of pop culture, I'm thinking how Bad Bunny has his album that came out. I wish I had taken more photographs, and the cover is like, it's like a quintessential white plastic chair that I think any ethnic immigrant person recognizes as like a thing, the thing that you see in gatherings. One of our other PhD candidates, Anna, he uses that as a prop in her sculpture installations. And so I think about that. And particularly for his tour, it's a Puerto Rican centered tour, and it prioritizes local. So you actually have to prove that of being local citizenship to go there. And then to bring it back to when I was in Zanzibar, it was a beautiful experience, but definitely experienced a lot of catfishing. One thing I learned from that experience is that Tanzanians have Tanzanians back in a very profound way that's about challenging these histories of tourism that are exploitive in terms of how you're talking about public beaches that are accessible to everyone versus like also there it's like illegal, although people always find ways to buy land on the sea, on the ocean, unless you are local and you have to do extensive paperwork to prove that. But also like when you land literally in the airport, they corral you and you're not allowed to leave and you have to pay. It's totally a scam, but I'm here for it. It's called like travel insurance. And it's like 50 USD and they make everyone pay it. I think they should just straight up call it reparations. But anyway, those are ways in which they kind of are finding ways of navigating this like cult of like tourism, because it's definitely not the locals that are really benefiting from it. And then yeah, New Year's Eve, we were mostly in these horrible touristy areas because wasn't familiar with the island at the time. But by the end of the trip, we're in a more like local region, so I was able to have the more like authentic experience with locals, like the Zanzibar where like Freddie Mercury grew up in, where there's all these wild cats walking around, and then seeing all these children and families that are swimming in the shore as like the sunset, you know. So that's what I hope for, and I think about in terms of Uganda as well. You know, the fallout of independence happened 50 plus years ago, but just the kind of fallout or aftermath of that, there's a lot of corruption amongst leaders, but also just who owns the land, who owns the properties. A lot of the power and a lot of the economy is not in the hands of like indigenous people to that land or place. So I'm definitely will fight for that in any way. And I'm here for the ways in which, from Bad Bunny to like the locals in Tanzania, how they're like disrupting these systems or finding alterities.
And not to jump ahead or around, but as some of the artists and like the works I'm thinking of, like in my decentering, like I'm thinking a lot about like Deborah Jack's work recently, and I'm thinking about Christopher Cozier's work and like Jocelyn Garner, who's like in the audience, and in like centering these Caribbean voices and like these critical conversations they're having, even to realize that people have been having these conversations and they just aren't necessarily present in the context that we're in, but like these conversations have been around and people are making this critical commentary. And like I think it came out this year or last 2024. It's called like Hurricane Season, and it features like a lot of different like Caribbean artists who were talking about like climate change and like disaster, like from a Caribbean centered perspective, which is like so illuminating because the region is being hit by like hurricanes and volcanic eruptions. And like I feel like it's one of those like points of convergence where you can like see immediately kind of those effects. Like they're not like abstract thoughts, that they're like happening in real time, which I think is like like those are important conversations that are like they should be at the forefront. But sorry, also thinking about like these Caribbean like artists and their work, also returning to like earlier works like of seascapes and landscapes of even like my childhood and my art teachers like Anne Dodson and like Janice Whittle, and like the work of like Alberta Whittle that was like in the 2022 Venice Biennale representing Scotland, which is also interesting. Like that's a Barbadian barn artist, and that's maybe like another conversation. But like returning to those kind of like traditional motifs, I think is also very present in my work. And like yeah, I'd like to think that if they saw it, it would kind of be like a nod to some of like those earlier like depictions of like home and those spaces.
Can you both speak to how memory, both personal and collective, inform your artistic practice?
Well, I'm really interested in history. That's always been like a crux of my art practice. I think I've always studied history in tandem with studying art. So sometimes I think that, you know, like the conceptual basis is rooted there, specifically like my interest around Caribbean and West African history and kind of like the unknown. I think that's an interesting aspect of memory. Earlier we had a conversation about, you know, like history being written by certain groups of people and history being skewed. So I think part of the like mystical or world building aspects that I try to access in my work are part of that like what if, like this kind of like, I don't want to say imaginary, but this like not part of our current reality, like these kinds of like different understandings or imaginings of the past, like almost like trying to fill the gaps.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm thinking about different knowledge systems. I have this memory of having to do a family tree for like a school project. And for context, my grandfather was Romani, and my grandmother is just white British, and then my dad is Ugandan, specifically from the Moyankole tribe. And so thinking about like oral traditions, like when I was trying to get history from my dad, he could go as far back as his grandfather, great grandfather, and that's like where it just stops. And then his mom, my grandmother, died in childbirth, unfortunately quite common in the continent, when he was 6 years old. So he doesn't really know a lot of her history. And then with my mom's side, again, it goes back to like my grandfather's grandfather. And then my grandmother can trace it back to like, I don't know, the 1700s. So it's just like, there's a lot missing, right? And that is totally tied up in imperialism and colonialism and what's erased. And I think about a lot of the first paintings or artworks I would see in museums, we talked about this earlier, are like these heroes that had like discovered lands and things like that. And I firmly believe that education, you can't just expect it to just be from the institution or the school. You can get it from many different places. Like I hold art figures and historians and like writers, like the so-called greats, on the same level as I do like my grandparents, my aunties, my uncles, teachers that I had that changed my life growing up. And so I also grew up in a family of like pedagogues, so like I'm just a nerd. But my the learning like never stopped at school. Like my dad would just give us extra homework. This is also because he's the firstborn son, and in African culture, the firstborn sons are always the golden child. So if you anyone that's studying psychology would know what that means, should know what that means. But or reading the Coles notes of it. But so, you know, he really wanted us to be like top of the class kind of thing. But he would teach us just from his own experiences, other histories that I wouldn't get from our like education here. So I would learn about, you know, all these countries in Africa gaining independence. I grew up with, he'd in his office have photos of like Patrice Lumumba and Nelson Mandela. And so I'm very grateful for the many different like places in which, and not just a watered down version of like the neoliberals who quote like Martin Luther King version of history, but you know, these like alternative histories that are like known in the body and known from the communities from which they come from. So that's how I think about collective memory. And a lot of it is still the stuff that's like unknowable. So like those places I'm missing from the family tree, I just have to accept or have resolve that I'm not gonna always know those things, but somehow they're like the juiciest material for my art, I have to say.
I also think for me, like a really great framework of thinking about it is like speculative, like Afro-futuristic kind of like frameworks, and like Octavia Butler's work, and kind of this like return again to like mining the past to like consider the future. I think it's prevalent like in what I hope I'm currently doing, and like a lot of other like I think it's like present in a lot of people's practices right now. I'm looking at this text on enslaved women's lives in Barbados by like Hilary Beckles. It's really illuminating. And I think for me, the most interesting part so far is it unflattens history, if that makes sense. Like, I think there's a lot of like before I've talked about like the flattening of people's identities when they like migrate, and how like people are like flattened into one thing in one group, and there's like no room for like different experiences and nuance. And I think the same thing happens within like historical texts and the way we like construct and think about history. But for me, when I started reading this text, like between like the graphs and the charts and like the writing, there are these moments of like lives of real people and like accounts that kind of just like illuminate layers for you of like what was like occurring like day to day in someone's life in like 1672. And it just like brings like the historical back to the present for me, like this like unflattening of like real people's lives.
On that note, so a couple years ago, my father was kind of going through things in our family home in Uganda, and he found a copy of his grandfather's autobiography. So for context, and my great grandfather passed away in the early 70s, and my grandfather was by his bedside and hand wrote his life story as he spoke it into our native tongue, which is Ruankole, and then also to like several other indigenous languages in Uganda. And so my dad had these handwritten like translations, and then translated to English and typed it all out. wrote a prologue or preface. But it's this incredible insight, because if we look at the kind of colonial like history there, a lot of it's tied up to like kind of missionary work. And so he describes like seeing the first time seeing like white people and the missionaries coming in. And it's kind of again about the minutia of day-to-day life in the western Uganda. It's a very hilly place. Like my ancestors are all like cattle herders, but it's like this incredible like document that my like siblings and I now have. And I think about that in terms of memory, or like just alternative kind of histories, because it's like that's something that I'm never going to get from any like formal like kind of history document. And it's like this beautiful like personal family heirloom and archive.
Okay, so to continue in that vein, Jessica, can I ask you how place kind of features in your work?
Yeah, it comes up a lot, I guess. Sometimes place is in the body, because I feel like definitely growing up in Sarnia, I did never feel at home there. And I always think that home, and which is place, is kind of where it's mobile. It's like where I am, and it's where my like family is, the people that are safe to me. I found a lot of like literature around like nomadism helpful to like work through that. So that's kind of a key thing in my relationship to place. It's anything that kind of like grounds me. So like if my feet are in the earth and I'm near a lake or the ocean, I'm like in my happy place. And I think my relationship place also has a lot to do with like displacement, these missing pieces, the kind of interstitial spaces that you can't really access or penetrate in terms of like lineage and history. Like that kind of age-old question of like who are you? What's the television series where they learn about their ancestry? They're like, who do you think you are? Yeah, who do you think you are? Like that's the question. You can follow up.
Give it to me again. I was listening to Jessica. I lost it.
How does place feature itself in your work?
Oh, I think some would say that my work is all about place. How does place not feature itself in my work? I think sometimes I tend to get the question or critique like, okay, so you go home to the Caribbean and you make all of this work there, and then you always exhibit it in a Canadian context. And it's always like, so what about that? Like, how do you feel about that? And then sometimes it's like maybe like curt or abrupt, my response, but
You could ask that about from any artist.
yeah, this is true.
Why don't you talk about your ancestry in Norway or wherever the place is?
But I don't know. I think for me, in some ways, it's also a much larger conversation that's like, okay, so I make the work in one place and I exhibit it in another, but like what has enabled that framework and why? Like, what are the positives that have enabled that framework, and what are the negatives that have enabled it to be like that? I know like Jocelyn is like nodding. Like Barbados has a national gallery. I don't know when it's gonna open. I think it's been under works for years. And then that is not a, oh, we need to get it together. That's a like, what are the larger like systemic frameworks that keep art and culture underdeveloped or developing, like within the Caribbean and a bunch of other places, as opposed to a place like this.
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents on that.
It makes sense because it's just like an extension of your embodied experience. Like you're an immigrant who lives between the two places, so your art, it just makes sense on that. Like what's not to get?
So can I ask how performance plays a role in both of your works?
Yeah, if I can throw it all the way back, I didn't experience performance growing up. The first time I experienced performance was in undergrad, and I was completely taken. I saw the work of a lot of white performance artists and like Euro-American centered kind of like frameworks, and it wasn't until like way later in my undergrad and my master's that I discovered like, oh, it's like Black people do this as well. So that was illuminating and really shifted the work I was making and what I was interested in. And that happened a lot during COVID, when I was able to spend a lot of time in Barbados and started like performing like at home with my family, and what it kind of like meant for me to kind of like do these like traditional performance artists kind of like acts or frameworks or movements and ideas, that but within my home and within the Caribbean. And that is also not to say that there are not also a ton of performance artists within the region. I just hadn't discovered them living here in Canada and having done my undergrad in Southern Ontario.
Yeah, it's like the omissions that happen when pedagogy is like centering like European viewpoints, particularly when we're talking about contemporary art. Like to me, that doesn't make any sense, or it's just very like American centered, I feel. In terms of performance, I don't do a lot of performance anymore unless like there's an opportunity to travel or the money is good, because I find that I'm not performing a character. It's not theater, but people consume it as theater. I'm enacting things. I am always myself in them, and it's very difficult to enforce those boundaries around there. It can be very unsafe. Also, there's particular ways in which people consume Black women's bodies. We're hypersexualized. Like, you're not going to see nearly as many naked Black women doing performance art as you are white women. Just a fact. But I think that speaks to like these kind of histories, right, that we're talking about. Yeah, it can be very tricky. I found, and also the work I do is deeply personal. I talk about my disability, my chronic illness. I talk about class. I talk about how, as a Black person, I've experienced all these different things. It's always through the channel of Blackness. And I found what I realized is if you're gonna do work that's kind of autobiographical or touching personal things, you really have to check in with your own boundaries and capacities. Like, are you ready to share this? How much you're gonna share? So I'm very discerning on that stuff. Like, I'm only letting you in so far, and just accept that as your damn gift. Like, don't come trying to extract more from me, because I find people do feel very entitled, not just to your work, but to you as like a person. And unless you're representing like a magazine or a publication and you need to like, I don't enjoy being like probed that way. It can be very like unrelenting, or it's trying to justify what you do. So performance has been an incredible channel for me, but I also like resent it deeply.
Someone That's valid. That's valid. I haven't performed in a long time either, but someone once asked me, how do I ethically perform with my family? And that was interesting. It was very many years ago, and I was caught very off guard. And I said, how do I what? I said, I point, click, shoot, and start play, and everyone just falls into place. And yes, that is definitely what I said a few years ago. And now looking at it, it's such a like a generative experience, like with all of us. Like everybody is involved, like from concept to shooting to editing. My mom, my sister, my grandmothers, they got a lot to say in how they are like portrayed or how they want to be put out into the world, which is like really great. And my granny's so happy to be on camera these days, which is like really nice for me because she's 87, and like it's really interesting to film with her now compared to when we first started, and like the way she'll like give the videographer like a lot of lip when it's like the shot's not lined up how like she thinks it should be, or she wants to like get going on something. And this is like, we're just, like we're winging it a lot of the time. There's not necessarily a formal structure, but just like
We're like a crew.
Yeah, just with us like working together over the years, like the way that she'll even like start and stop things like for the shot is just like so interesting to me, how she's like developed this understanding of filming these videos with me, but like still doesn't know how to call me on WhatsApp, like on her cell phone.
That's so real.
Racquel, can I ask, is there a specific way you want people to experience your work?
For this show, yes. Like I think like the couch and my cushions and like the setup is deliberate and hoping people like again like sit, sink, and get lost. And I think I usually do like a lot of full scale projections like this, and I really wanted to see what it would be like for people to have to kind of like pay. Like I think that a large scale projection kind of pulls you in a different way, and it's almost like easier in some regards to feel immersed in the work. But what happens when you have to work for it a little more? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then can I ask, how do you guys both navigate the tension between a personal narrative and a collective history in your work?
I think that kind of relates to the ethical question you're asking and what I was saying about like boundaries.
Give me the question again.
How do you navigate the tension between personal narratives and collective history in your work?
I think that one kind of comes up for me a lot because I'm always using the personal to talk about the collective in some like way, shape, or form. Like even with all the works that feature like my family, and I'm looking at like larger like concerns of domestic spaces and like cultural continuity, and like women as like stewards of like culture, of like various cultures. And like I think those things also do come across. I think that, I think the personal is political, the political is personal. But I think that especially when you're like performing these like rituals or like these like acts of care, and then having other people kind of witness those and like bring them to their own experiences, I think that's where like that kind of like convergence of the two happen.
I'm totally with you. I think what you're talking about, how you're addressing the relationship between the personal and the collective, that's the kind, when I say representation, I'm talking about that. I'm not talking about like, look how many Black people are nominated for Oscars. Like that's become a product of capital. That's a distraction from like the actual like work that is like happening. I'm more interested in like when someone shares a story and, you know, whether it's in a authentic, like a conversation, maybe it's a film, maybe maybe it's usually it's through art. And I'm like, I understand this. That is what it's more of a feeling. That's how I understand like representation and the type of representation I'm trying to evoke. And I just think it's more authentic to start with, and maybe more ethical to start with what you know, versus like it's fine to accept the limitations of your experience and knowledge, and like especially in a world where like it's impossible not to have unconscious bias, racism, ableism, all the like things, even if you are insert whatever minority, right? I think that it's good to start with what you know. That's I think also why I wanted to start with myself before I invited anyone into the fold, like because I have had my dad and sister, like in video pieces of and artworks of mine. It's a very vulnerable thing to do. And also these works exist in perpetuity, right? We don't talk about that as well. I don't think it really affects my family, but I'm also not going to pretend that I'm siloed away from an AI conversation where like you lose any autonomy or agency over or control over circulation of your image. But I do think like if you're not, you should be very like careful with like that as well. Yeah.
I also like thinking about other like things I'm exploring, like with like my grandparents and their own migration to like the UK as part of like the Windrush generation, and working with like imagery from like that journey that I'm like still really like sticky and touchy about, and like will not hear a critique about it necessarily yet, because it's so precious to me. And but thinking about like that work and those photos and those experiences as part of like much larger discussions and like timely discussions, like over the past few years, like how many people have been deported as part of the Windrush generation in the UK, who have lived there their entire lives. So I feel like there's like yeah, they're very much like intertwined for me, like both like the work and like my family and the political. And even I just wanted to mention at the beginning, we were chatting about just life, and Kara mentioned, oh, like going home to Jamaica and getting wisdom teeth out. And I felt like I was looking in a mirror, because I could just remember like going home to Barbados in undergrad to get dental work.
I think that's a thing that a lot of immigrants have in common. Insert whatever surgery it is, go home to get it done.
Oh yeah, one last question for you guys. You can whisper in my ear if you don't want to tell anybody else, but can you share anything you're working on right now? Whisper in my ear, tell me.
I'm working on the PhD qualifying exams, which are really painful. I'm writing my lit review, whatever that is. And I am always working on 2 to 3 projects at the same time. Right now, I am looking similar work, but I'm back in it, looking at like body as the island, like embodying landscapes and what it looks like when I place like myself within these like settings, but like within photography and those histories of representation. So we'll see what that looks like eventually when it's further along.
If I say it out loud, then I have to like stick to it. So I guess this is a trick I do to myself to like punish myself. But I'm working, I guess, on a monograph, because I think it's like an important. I need to give myself more due credit or diligence and make that happen. I found out this morning, like a few weeks earlier than I anticipated, that I got an OAC grant. So that means I have to like work on something. I won't share the thing because I'll share it with you afterwards, but it's even like there's a couple, like 2 people in the audience that know about the project that I'm working on, but it's still in the beginning stages and very personal, but I'm very excited to work on that project. Try to work on it a little bit. You know, on my weekends are like research time, but I feel as though a lot of the summer will be spent on that and then early next year. So.
Okay, great. I would love to open up any questions to the audience, if anybody has any. Okay, I'll give you a second and ask a question of my own because I'm really curious. Earlier when we were talking about the body, you mentioned that there's a distinct like absence of your body in this specific work. If you look at historically art of the Caribbean being from a very Eurocentric, I want to convince people to come here, I want to document it, it's an outsider perspective. Do you think even though your body is absent in the work, you're physically present in the fact that you position the camera, you like kind of frame what is and isn't there?
Oh,
Great
yeah,
question.
great question. I like that I frame what isn't there, and that is so interesting to me because a lot of the videos of the water are really specific fragments of like the same beach, and they're like zoomed in to exclude certain things. Huh. That's a good question.
To that point, earlier when we were talking about, we were talking about like control is time for your
Yeah.
installation, or if you care about that. How I experience your work is I think you're very particular in how you orient objects and images. And I think like it definitely takes some sculpture and installation training to do that. And it makes you honestly a better filmmaker, a better painter, a better drawer, even if you're not working in a sculpture installation medium, because you're anticipating how the audience is going to engage it. So like in this room, there's like a door right there. There's like that hideous fluorescent light that like emanates from that. Even how Greg set this like space up to make it more conducive for experiencing like this, and then how we've placed the paper for an exercise, you know, like this isn't high art, but I don't know, I'm always thinking about that. Like placing this carpet here demarcates the space. It's like a partition that like distinguishes it from the space there. So like I think you have a very precise eye. And that happens in the installation. And to your point in the videos, like especially because they're fragmented. Like right now, what we're seeing here, you're trying to make sense of what it is you're looking at. Is that like a banana leaf, or am I looking at flesh? I'm not really, I mean, it's flesh either way, but I'm not really like sure, you know?
I think that's also an interesting question in relation to like what and where and when I'm choosing to like capture when I'm like in Barbados as well, or like what I deliberately leave out, or like how I'm thinking about the way in which like I frame the island and like which like parts of it I'm capturing. That's a good question.
Also, absented presence, like Norbeze Philip writes about that. Catherine McKittrick, citing Norbeze, writes about that. I think that comes up too in the works, that kind of like haunting. And I think that also connects to like the mining memory and like history, what is omitted from like the dominant narrative, right? So we can write, even in Canada, a particular history, even though like Black people have been here for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? A narrative that exists outside these like cultural centers, whether that be like Nova Scotia, Montreal, Toronto, like the prairies, the communities that we know of, like that there's all these other histories, right?
Yeah, I think even like sometimes I think to myself internally that even in like my framing of Barbados, I'm like, in my mind, I don't think I actually necessarily frame it like somebody who lives there. I'm there like twice a year. I still I have to use Google Maps to like.
No, but
get
again, you
some-
frame it, it's directly, your art's completely derivative of you. It's like an extension of you. So that's why, no, like I don't think you need to justify it, but also
But
it makes sense that it'd be a very particular
I think
perspective.
it is like interesting, like that very particular perspective of like being between the two, like a foot in both doors, kind of creates like the way I've like structured my understanding of that place.
My friend who's Palestinian describes as having one lung there and the other lung here.
I'd like to open the floor again.
Thank you. This is good. First of all, this was amazing to hear. And I personally am very interested in water and how water connects people in general, but more of how water separates people. And I wanted to ask, how do you navigate as a filmmaker the violent and turbulent histories of water and how people have access or don't have access to water and beaches and territories and can't see those beaches? How do you navigate those experiences in your work?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would like to. I think that for me, a large part of like addressing some of those larger and heavy concerns of like who has access to this space right now and who doesn't and how to bring attention to it. I think that sometimes, so hear me out. I think that sometimes, at least in like this work, like I think this work is quiet and it's contemplative. And I think that it's also kind of like hopeful and joyful. And I think that I'm like a forever optimist. And to me, there's something just in the way some of it is captured, then reproduced, and then the story's told, and then hopefully it kind of like can spark some other like conversations, dialogue, like even so in like the two water videos that are in this work, and like when I've written about them, like I talk about, oh, like I've gone to the local section of the watering hole, which I think is a thing, and it may be in my head, but it looks like that in reality to me, where there's like spots like that are like those are tourist spots, and then there's an open section, and then that is kind of a local spot, and how I can like bring some kind of like nuanced discussion to these things that are happening that we're not really talking about. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think that I'm navigating it by doing it and experiencing it and being kind of pissed off, but continuing to do it anyway, and then hoping to like bring those conversations or the work eventually home.
We have a question from the webinar from Era, who asks, as people who are working artists and at the same time teachers, what would you consider to be the most important pedagogy that you can bring to the classroom?
Oh. Damn.
Thank you, Era.
You should go first.
Right now, because it's feeling kind of turbulent, maybe a pedagogy of both care and also unlearning. Maybe a pedagogy that centers unlearning some of our instincts when it comes to how we even view and talk about our own work and the work of others. And maybe kind of like, I think that there's this really interesting thing that happens in art school, like between action and causation, and kind of bringing meaning to what you're doing and practicing and making. And I think that like in my own practice right now, I'm trying to just focus on consistency, or like to continue showing up even when you don't want to, and to continue making, but also like recognizing within these systems like how to like create aspects of care within teaching.
Yeah, I think the consistency is really important. We're dealing with young people that we were talking about this earlier in class, that, you know, like prime, very crucial points of development, like whether that be like high school for them. Socialization was completely typical. Socialization was completely undone. You know, we have generations of young folk like, and also adults, I'll include myself in that, who are, you know, emotionally dysregulated and still recovering from like how that like so quickly things change in 2020, and all the like political upheaval, annihilation of kind of infrastructures put in place to like buttress up marginalized folks. In terms of like the pedagogy question, I think like trying to check in with yourself, being open to like whatever the script failing and adapting like on the fly. So it's good to have something in place. Like I'm someone like I love having you should see my calendar. I have notes, I have things written down, but just kind of sometimes you have to go off script. It's almost like being a DJ where you have to energetically respond to what's going on. I really do see it as like almost like a musical kind of experience. So that needs to happen. And also not slipping to a place where you're just pontificating, like you're almost leaning a bit too into the role of a teacher and romanticizing, or, there's a job that you're there to do, and the care, but also not letting that diverge too much into a space that is problematic, because there are limitations to what our role is. We're not social workers, we're not therapists, right? So how to find that balance between being a human being in relation to other human beings that have maybe a bit less experience than you generationally, but they still might have some power over you in terms of like gender, race, or like how do you navigate all those things? So yeah, care I think is very important, being adaptable, and also okay to kind of receive feedback and kind of give it, yeah, like staying humble, but also like owning the like authority that you have.
I will also add, like, to me, care is also like the tough conversations. And also, it's like really hard to bring like Black and Indigenous pedagogies to predominantly white classrooms. Like, that just is what a fact of what it is. Like, in teaching to transgress, like, it like really sticks with me. Bell hooks, like, acts, like, how can we teach people who aren't like us? Like, how, and I think that is what like all kind of like POC educators are trying to figure out and how to do. But like back to the tough conversations, like I think that care and like a pedagogy like of like liberation or
I think
in the class,
I think also if you're used to seeing your voice or possibly model represented, so maybe it's like the feminine wave. Like I'm thinking like, Jane Austen, from a Jane Austen novel to like, I don't know, any like 90s soap opera or whatever you see now where like, the insert, it can never be multiple. Oh, either be the token Black person or token whatever person that's like the friend or sidekick. When you're socialized with that type of imagery in like pop culture and in literature, like the dominant narratives in history books and things, it really does a number on you. So someone might be like, why? Because it is a bit like it's decentering, right? And that is very destabilizing. Like whiteness innately has a narcissism to it. You're used to being the center and neutral, seen it not just as this being centered, but it's being seen as a neutral voice, which is absurd. And so yeah, I think there can be a bit of like hostility or pushback from that. There's all like most of the time it's great, but without fail, there's always like one or two that are like hostile towards it. And
yeah, you have to like have those like tough conversations like in the classroom.
Before we wrap up, can I just ask if any of you have any final reflections or anything you'd like to share?
Yes, and I call them tough conversations because I think that they are shattering to like some worldviews.
Mm-hmm.
Like it might not be inherently like difficult to like discuss. Like, hey, here's this like whole other set of frameworks for you to look at and examine in relation to like this topic XYZ. But when there's like this, I don't know, barrier or like wall to bring down, like those are like difficult discussions to have. And how can you approach them with still like empathy?
Yeah.
I
have nothing to add to that. I think that's great.
Okay, I'm sure you guys will stick around, so if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask after. But before we wrap up, I'd just like to thank everybody so much for attending, both in person and on Zoom. Hi, I see you.
Yeah, I'd love to thank the organizers and SASAH for letting us have this event. And guys, like Forest City Gallery, like go see the exhibition. It closes on March 8th. Go, please. It's so amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, so have a great day, everybody, and get home safe.